Welcome everyone to part 3 of chapter 3, where we're going to continue our discussion on bioenergetics. Today in this particular lecture, we're going to discuss ATP production, primarily the anaerobic pathways. And so how does the body create ATP? Well, the first is we need to discuss is stored ATP. So when we look at cells, particularly skeletal muscle, again we're going to denote that as SKM, it has stored ATP in itself. It has enough ATP stored to do about 2 to 3 seconds worth of work. This is a very short amount of time. And so what I want you to do is envision your index finger. Just move your index finger once or twice. That movement is less than a second. The body doesn't create new ATP for that movement to occur. The skeletal muscle that generates the contraction for the movement of that index finger uses its stored ATP in order to make that movement happen. But what happens when a work lasts longer than these 2 to 3 seconds? Well, in this case, the body needs to start creating new ATP, and they do this through a couple of different processes. The first being the phosphocreatine pathway, the second being the glycolytic pathway, and third being the oxidative phosphorylation pathway. The oxidative phosphorylation pathway is also termed aerobic respiration. So aerobic respiration and oxidative phosphorylation are kind of used interchangeably. The ATP production pathways can be broken into two categories. The first being denoted as anaerobic. And what this means is oxygen is not used with ATP production. The phosphocreatine and the glycolytic pathways are considered anaerobic because they do not utilize oxygen in their pathways to create ATP. Now, conversely, oxidative phosphorylation, also known as aerobic respiration, is probably, as you guessed it, aerobic. And what we mean by aerobic is oxygen is involved with ATP production. And with this rest of this video, we're going to cover the phosphocreatine and the glycolytic pathways, or the anaerobic pathways. So one of the questions that I typically get is, how does the body choose which energy pathway it uses to produce ATP? The two variables involved with this choice in the production pathway is intensity versus duration. Let's put this into a little bit of context. Looking at two different athletes, we have a sprinter and a marathon runner. Looking at the sprinter, let's say the athlete is doing the 100-meter sprint. Thinking about this type of effort, we know this effort is very, very intense. It's a maximal type of effort, but the duration is really low. And what I mean by that is, if we look at it in sense of time, it only lasts anywhere between 10 to 13 seconds. Conversely, when we look at a marathon runner, the intensity is moderate to low, but the duration is extremely long. So for example, it could last from anywhere from two and a half to about 4.5 hours, depending on how intense and how fast that runner is going. And when we look at these two different athletes, they're going to be utilizing two different energy pathways. Whereas the sprinter is going to be using more of the phosphocreatine pathway, and the marathon runner is going to be utilizing oxidative phosphorylation. What is being demonstrated here is the energy pathway is highly dependent on how intense and the length of the exercise or the activity is. And so let's put this in some other contextual terms. In this figure, we have the 4 different energy pathways depicted. The first here in blue is ATP. Here in black is the phosphocreatine. Here in the that dash is the glycolytic, and here is the aerobic pathway. So first here, what's being demonstrated with the solid blue line is within 2 seconds, the body has utilized all of its stored ATP. Second, here with the black line, within 2 seconds, the body starts utilizing the phosphocreatine pathway to start creating and restoring ATP for energy usage. But by the end of 10 to 12 seconds, the body is no longer utilizing the phosphocreatine pathway, because then it is converted over to the glycolytic pathway, which typically runs from anywhere from 10 seconds all the way out to about 2 minutes to create ATP. And then roughly at about the 2-minute mark, the oxidative phosphorylation pathway starts to kick in to create ATP and stays that way until the exercise is complete. One of the key takeaways from this figure as well is that these don't work in a stovepipe fashion, is that all these pathways work in tandem together. And if we refer down to the bottom part of this figure, let's look primarily here at the aerobic pathway. And so what we see here is the first part of time in seconds and the second part here time in minutes. And if we look at 3 seconds, 30 seconds, and 50 seconds into the exercise, which is kind of this point here off to the left, ATP is produced very minimally by the aerobic pathways. It's not until we get at this 2-minute mark where the majority of ATP is being produced. However, if we look at the phosphocreatine and the glycolytic pathways, there's still about 25% of ATP being produced at minute 4. And if we go here at minute 60, if not longer, ATP production is roughly 98% from the aerobic pathway here. However, we still have a little bit being produced by the anaerobic pathways. So, and this is what we're saying, is they're still working in tandem, but it is still guided by intensity versus duration. So, digging a little bit deeper into our anaerobic ATP production pathways, the first is the phosphocreatine pathway, also known as the PCR pathway. And the reason this is such a vital pathway is because it's an immediate source of ATP production. This pathway can create 1 ATP very quickly. This pathway utilizes phosphocreatine to create ATP. So when you take phosphocreatine and you add a single adenosine diphosphate, or ADP, you can create ATP. But this process utilizes the enzyme creatine kinase. This reaction is considered a high energy investment reaction. And so, going back to what we discussed in the very first video, we stated that enzymes help lower the activation energy necessary for the reaction to occur. And we see that in this example with creatine kinase. So moving into our next anaerobic pathway is we're going to talk about is glycolysis. And so what is glycolysis? The Powers textbook defines glycolysis as the metabolic pathway in the cytoplasm of a cell that results in the degradation of glucose into pyruvate or lactate. And so what we're saying is we're taking glucose, which again is C6H12O6, it's converted to pyruvate and lactate through a series of intermediate steps. And so let's go over those steps that are part of the glycolytic pathway. Now, when we look at the steps of glycolysis, it can be broken down into two parts. The first part, or the first half of glycolysis, is called the energy investment phase. And during these first initial steps of glycolysis, we are adding in 2 ATP into the process. So basically the body is burning 2 ATP to get glycolysis going. The second half of glycolysis is known as the energy generation phase. And from this phase, we actually produce 4 ATP. And so when it's all said and done, at the end of glycolysis, we have a net production or net gain of 2 ATP. And this is because we burn 2 at the first half, and we only produce 4 in the second half of glycolysis. So let's talk about the first part of the glycolytic pathway. And again, we called that the energy investment phase. And so these are the steps. So glucose first enters into the cytoplasm of the cell in its original form. And as it travels through, it is converted into what we call glucose 6-phosphate. And at this point, what we're doing is we're adding in a phosphate onto the glucose molecule itself. And this is done by burning an ATP. And the enzyme involved with this is called hexokinase. And it's important to remember that this is a rate-limiting step as part of the glycolytic process. Now from there, the glucose 6-phosphate is transformed into fructose 6-phosphate. And all that is occurring at this point is the carbon ring is being converted into a different type of ring. And at this point, what we're doing is then we're moving into another rate-limiting step where we're adding on another phosphate. And again, we are burning another ATP. And the enzyme involved with this is called phosphofructokinase. Also known as PFK for short. And so at this point, with the addition of the second phosphate molecule, we have now created a molecule called fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. And basically all this is saying is we've added in a phosphate on the first carbon and then a phosphate on the 6th carbon. And so this is why it's called the energy investment phase, because we have to burn 2 ATP to add in the energy necessary to create more ATP at the end of the glycolytic pathway. And so the energy investment phase ends with the splitting of the fructose 1,6-bisphosphate by the enzyme called ATPase. And so what we're doing is the ATPase is splitting the fructose 1,6-bisphosphate into 2 separate 3-carbon atoms. And at this point, we are now starting to enter into the energy harvesting phase steps. And so what you're going to see, the same energy harvesting steps for the second half of the glycolytic pathway for two separate molecules. And so what's occurring is the aldolase, it has split the fructose 1,6-bisphosphate into what we call glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. And what we're saying here is the glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is now a 3-carbon chain instead of a 6. And so going along these energy harvesting steps, our glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, also known as G3P, is converted into 1,3-bisphoglycerate, also known as BPG. As part of this conversion, the molecule NAD+ is reduced to NADH. And so within this first step, we produce 2 NADH, which are used as a part of the electron transport chain. Move along into the second step. Our molecule BPG is now converted into 3-phosphoglycerate, also known as 3PG. And during this conversion, the body harvests its first set of 2 ATP. Then from there, 3PG is further converted into phosphopyruvate, or PEP. And then the phosphopyruvate is then converted into pyruvate itself. And this is where we harvest our second set of ATP. And so what we find is at the levels of BPG to 3PG and our PEP to pyruvate, these are the steps that create our ATP. And then since we had already invested 2 ATP in the first half of the glycolytic pathway, this is why we only have a net gain of 2 ATP by the end of the glycolytic process. So we've covered a lot in this video, but let's break it down to the key points that you need to know to be successful on the exam and the second half of this class. First is know the anaerobic pathways. And we stated that this was the PCR, ATP pathway, and the glycolytic pathway. And so within the glycolytic pathway, know the reaction and the enzyme involved, which is creatine kinase. The second is the glycolytic pathway. Within this, you need to know every step. This includes the names of the intermediates, the rate-limiting enzymes, and where ATP is created and used. Secondly, we covered how the variables of intensity versus duration affected what energy pathway is used to create ATP. Be sure to understand this and be able to explain it. I know the glycolytic pathway covers a lot of material, but take your time, take it step by step. You'll be able to do this. Please let me know if you have any questions. Take care and have a great afternoon.